The first time Oklahoma and Ohio State played was also here in Columbus back in 1977. A very similar matchup to this year. Two top 5 teams early in the season in a game with national championship implications. It came down to the final seconds and a junior OU kicker from Germany who produced one of the most famous plays in Sooner history. The kick defined his OU career, but there's so much more to Uwe von Schamann.
41-yard field goal to win it. It is long enough. It is good. Wow. With 3 seconds to play in the game.
It's simply the most famous field goal in Oklahoma football history. Sooner fans call it the kick. Uwe von Schamann's 41-yard field goal to beat Ohio State in Columbus in the first meeting between the two college football powers. For the man who kicked the field goal, it's become a moment he's reminded about constantly.
Not every day, but maybe every other day. I usually have 1 or 2 people come up to me and tell me where they were, what they did.
NCAA football from Ohio Stadium in Columbus, Ohio. The Sooners of Oklahoma against the Buckeyes of Ohio State.
Oklahoma jumped to a 20-0 lead before the Buckeyes scored the next 28 points to lead 28-20. The Sooners responded, though, and after recovering an onside kick with 1.5 minutes to play, moved into position to give von Schamann a chance to win it.
I heard the crowd block that kick, and I usually don't hear the crowd, but in that instance I did. Yeah, I don't know why I did it, but I just led the chant.
Von Schamann's field goal not only won the game and upset legendary Ohio State coach Woody Hayes, it made OU coach Barry Switzer so happy he kissed Uwe.
We were in the locker room, and he said, everybody on defense gets a game ball, and Uwe gets a kiss. Layla is not necessarily an OU fan, but today you are, right?
These days, von Schamann is giving back, serving on the board at the Children's Center Rehabilitation Hospital in Bethany, and visiting with children fighting battles most of us can't imagine.
I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with the kids. You know, they work so hard when they do their rehabilitation, and we celebrate when they reach certain goals. You know, to us they might be just small, but to them they're huge.
Not long ago, von Schamann had his own health scare. Diagnosed with colon cancer, recently he rang the bell to symbolize the end of his treatment.
I think I almost tore it off the wall. Somebody asked me, what's the biggest moment for you, ringing the bell or making that field goal? And goes, I'll probably have to pick the bell, you know, because that's kind of life-changing, you know, for you when you go through something like that.
Ringing the bell may mean more now, but the kick still rings true 40 years later. It even inspired a painting by Tulsa artist Jay O'Melia.
It's humbling. I mean, it's pretty neat.
But for one of his OU coaches, it's a bittersweet memory for other reasons.
One of my coaches told his girlfriend before the game that if they win the game, he would marry her. And I saw him 5 years later, and he goes, "I sure wished you would have missed that."
That's probably the best story Uwe told, and maybe the only OU fan who wished Uwe had missed that kick. Von Schamann will actually be here at the game tomorrow. We'll have a lot more for you coming up tomorrow, previewing the game at 6 o'clock. In Columbus, I'm Brian Brinkley, Oklahoma's News 4 Sports. We're outside Heinz Field in downtown Pittsburgh, home of the NFL's Pittsburgh Steelers. It's also the home of the Pittsburgh Panther football team, which will host Oklahoma State Saturday at 11 a.m. Pitt has a unique connection to OSU. Jimmy Johnson and Pat Jones, two future OSU head coaches, were assistants together at Pitt. Jimmy for 2 years, Pat for 1 year. Earlier this week, I talked to Pat after his radio talk show in Tulsa about his 1 season as a Pitt assistant. Pat Jones was only at Pittsburgh for 1 season, but his impressions of the city, the school, and the region are still vivid nearly 40 years later.
Pittsburgh is really a good town. It's very, in a general sense, hardworking. There was a lot of Western Pennsylvania kids, tough, fun to coach. I remember Jimmy telling me when he went up there, he said, these are the toughest kids in a general sense that he's ever coached.
It's the Penn State Nittany Lions versus the Pitt Panthers.
Pitt was in its prime at the time. The 1978 season was just 2 years after the Panthers had won the national championship and Tony Dorsett had won the Heisman Trophy. and the roster was filled with future stars.
I was coaching the outside linebackers at that point in time. Well, I had one guy named Hugh Green, who later almost won the Heisman Trophy, and the other one, who really was only a part-time starter, was Ricky Jackson from Pahokee, Florida. Well, he's got a bust in Canton. So, you know, but it was probably in the modern era the greatest time for Pitt football.
Not only did Pitt have talented players, but an outstanding staff to coach them. Under head coach Jackie Sherrill, Pitt had 4 assistants who went on to become head coaches: Foge Fazio, Dave Wanstedt, Jimmy Johnson, and Pat Jones.
And this was a pretty high-powered staff of guys, yes.
Pitt finished the regular season 7-4 with a bid to play North Carolina State in the Tangerine Bowl. But Johnson had already accepted the head coaching job at Oklahoma State, and Pat Jones was coming with him to be the Cowboys' defensive coordinator.
You had a split staff. That was a little bit funky. In all honesty, the practices were awful. We're trying to recruit down here. I'm calling kids in Oklahoma, and all I can remember was just Jimmy and I saying, as soon as we can get our gear and get off and get back to Pittsburgh and get on a plane to Stillwater, let's go.
Jones became part of a talented staff at OSU that included Wanstedt, future Dallas Cowboys assistant Tony Wise, and future college and NFL head coach Butch Davis. Jones eventually succeeded Johnson as OSU's head coach, and after a pair of really good seasons in 1984 and 85 at OSU, Jones nearly took up Pitt's offer to become the Panthers' head coach.
Had we taken the job at Pitt, see, that was the class that we recruited Gundy in. I would like to think that Mike would have come to Stillwater anyway. Now, Mike's claiming, he's told me he wasn't. He said he'd gone to OU. I think he's just making me feel good. But, you know, the ifs, what ifs about that whole scenario kind of get interesting.
You know the rest of the story. Pat stayed at Oklahoma State. Gundy came to OSU, was an outstanding quarterback, and eventually became the head coach, and now has the Cowboys ranked 9th in the country. They'll take on Pitt Saturday at 11 a.m. We'll be there to cover it for you with complete reports at 6 and 10 on Saturday evening. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I'm Brian Brinkley, Oklahoma's News 4 Sports.